You stand in the Roman Forum on a cold morning in 91 AD, and the silence around you feels wrong. Usually, this place buzzes with merchants hawking goods, lawyers arguing cases, and citizens conducting the business of empire. But today, thousands of people line the marble streets in absolute quiet, their faces pale with something between horror and fascination. You pull your cloak tighter as a funeral procession approaches. Except this isn't quite a funeral because the person inside the covered litter is still breathing. You watch the bearers move slowly through the crowd, their steps measured and ceremonial. The litter they carry is sealed shut, draped in white burial cloths, but you can see it moving slightly. Someone alive sits inside, dressed like a corpse, being paraded through Rome's heart toward a fate that makes execution seem merciful. The woman hidden behind those curtains held more power than most senators, could pardon condemned criminals with a word, and had safeguarded Rome's most sacred flame for over 20 years. Her name is Cornelia, chief Vestal Virgin, the holiest woman in the empire. You realize you're witnessing something that will echo through history, the living burial of an innocent priestess, ordered by an emperor who claims divine authority while committing sacrilege. The air smells of incense from nearby temples, but underneath it, you catch something else, the earthy scent of freshly dug soil from the tomb waiting at the city's edge. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. But what if the holiest woman in Rome isn't dying for sin? She's dying for politics. You need to understand what it means to be a Vestal Virgin in this world, because without that knowledge, you can't grasp the full horror of what's unfolding. You live in a society where women pass from their father's control to their husbands without ever tasting legal independence. But there are 6 exceptions: the Vestal Virgins, chosen as children to serve Vesta, goddess of hearth and home, for 30 years of absolute chastity. You watch these women move through Roman society with privileges that astound you. They own property in their own name, something your sister will never do. They write wills, testify in court, and sit in the best seats at gladiatorial games, while senators' wives watch from lesser positions. You've seen condemned prisoners literally saved by accidentally crossing a Vestal's path. Her presence alone grants pardon. They ride in special carpenta carriages, preceded by lictors who clear the way, untouchable and inviolate. You remember the day you first saw Cornelia in her role as Virgo Maxima. She stood before the Temple of Vesta during a state ceremony, her white robes brilliant in the sunlight, her face serene with the confidence of someone who speaks directly to the gods. The sacred flame flickered behind her, the fire that represents Rome's eternal survival. You believed, as everyone around you believed, that as long as that flame burned and the Vestals remained pure, the empire would endure. The selection process horrifies you when you learn the details. Girls between 6 and 10 years old, children who giggle at silly jokes and play with wooden dolls, undergo examination like prize livestock. Officials check their teeth, their limbs, their family bloodlines. The chosen child performs the captio ceremony, where she's ritually captured by the state and severed from all family ties. You imagine your own daughter at that age, suddenly transformed from beloved child to sacred property. And yet, your power comes with a single impossible rule: never love, never touch. You learn what happens when a Vestal breaks her vow of chastity, and the punishment makes your blood freeze. Romans call it immurement, being buried alive, but you discover it's designed with calculated cruelty that goes beyond simple execution. You realize the Romans have engineered a death that appears bloodless and voluntary while maximizing psychological torture. You stand at the Campus Celeratus, the evil field just inside Rome's walls, watching workers prepare Cornelia's tomb. They dig a chamber barely large enough for a person to stand, then place inside it symbolic provisions: a piece of bread, a jug of water, a container of milk, some oil. These aren't meant to sustain life. You understand they're ritual gestures that allow Romans to claim they're not technically committing murder. The condemned woman will choose her own death, suffocation, dehydration, or starvation. The chamber design appalls you. Once sealed, it becomes a coffin for the living. You imagine the complete darkness after the small lamp burns out, the gradually thinning air, the slow realization that no rescue will come. Death arrives over days or weeks, each moment stretching into an eternity of suffering. You realize this isn't just execution, it's torture disguised as religious necessity. You learn that Vestal blood cannot be spilled because they're too sacred for ordinary violence. This constraint forces Romans to invent something worse than murder, a death that must appear voluntary and bloodless while being utterly brutal. The victim becomes complicit in her own destruction, seemingly choosing to die rather than live with dishonor. No blood must fall, so they invent a death that doesn't need blood. You turn your attention to the man who ordered Cornelia's death, Emperor Domitian, whose paranoia and moral posturing have already cost other lives. You remember his rise to power after his brother Titus died unexpectedly, leaving him to rule an empire he never expected to inherit. From the beginning, you notice his obsession with appearing morally pure while committing increasingly corrupt acts. You witness Domitian's first purge of the Vestals between 87 and 90 AD. 3 priestesses, women whose names you barely learn before they disappear, are accused of unchastity and buried alive. You realize these executions serve multiple purposes. They position the emperor as a moral reformer, terrorize the senatorial class from which the Vestals come, and demonstrate that no one stands beyond imperial reach. The accusations always lack specifics, you observe. No witnesses testify to seeing improper behavior. No evidence of secret meetings or love letters emerges. Instead, you hear vague claims about suspicious conduct and inappropriate familiarity with men. You begin to understand that in Domitian's Rome, accusation equals guilt when the emperor wills it so. You watch the atmosphere in the city change after each execution. Senators speak more carefully, measuring every word. Families with daughters in the Vestal Order live in constant fear. You realize the emperor's spies are everywhere, and any interaction can be twisted into evidence of impropriety. A smile becomes flirtation, a conversation becomes conspiracy, a stumble becomes drunkenness, indicating moral corruption. If terror is the message, who dares read it aloud? You need to understand who Cornelia was before her destruction, because her story reveals the calculated nature of her persecution. You learn she entered the Vestal Order as a child during the reign of Vespasian, Domitian's father, and rose through decades of faithful service to become Virgo Maxima. You realize she tended Rome's sacred flame through political upheavals, natural disasters, and imperial transitions without a whisper of scandal. You remember seeing her during major state ceremonies, always composed, always dignified, performing rituals with the precision of someone who understood their cosmic importance. She blessed military victories, interceded for condemned prisoners, and maintained the sacred traditions that Romans believed kept their empire strong. You recall how even hardened senators showed her deference, how crowds parted respectfully when her carriage passed. Most significantly, you discover Cornelia had already been accused of unchastity earlier in her career and was acquitted after proper investigation. The evidence proved insufficient. The charges appeared motivated by personal vendettas, and she returned to her duties with her reputation intact. You realize this previous acquittal makes Domitian's later accusations even more suspicious. You learn that Cornelia served as Virgo Maxima for over a decade, overseeing the religious ceremonies that marked Rome's calendar. She trained younger Vestals, managed temple finances, and participated in diplomatic ceremonies with foreign dignitaries. You understand that her position made her one of the most visible and influential women in the empire, which also made her a target. If you kept Rome's flame alive, how could you be impure? You witness the mockery of justice that condemns Cornelia to death. Unlike her previous trial, this time she isn't allowed to defend herself. You learn that Domitian orders her condemnation absent and unheard, meaning she faces no formal charges, presents no defense, and confronts no witnesses. The College of Pontifices simply announces her guilt and sentences her to immurement. You realize this violates fundamental principles of Roman law, even under imperial rule. Citizens traditionally enjoyed the right to face their accusers, present evidence, and argue their cases before neutral judges. But you observe that Domitian's regime increasingly dispenses with legal protections when they become politically inconvenient. The emperor's will becomes the only law that matters. The charges against Cornelia remain deliberately vague, you notice. No specific acts are alleged, no lovers named, no witnesses brought forward. You understand this vagueness serves Domitian's purposes. It makes the accusations impossible to disprove while allowing him to claim moral authority. You can't defend against charges that are never clearly stated. You watch the College of Pontifices announce their decision with obvious reluctance. These high priests understand they're not dispensing religious justice, but carrying out political orders. You see the fear in their faces as they pronounce sentence. They know they could be next if they displease the emperor. The whole proceeding has the hollow ring of theater performed for an audience that knows the ending was predetermined. What if the trial is not to find truth, but to bury it? You follow the funeral procession as it winds through Rome's streets toward Cornelia's tomb. The covered litter moves at walking pace, allowing maximum exposure and deterrent effect. You notice how the crowds part in terrified silence. No one dares show sympathy for the condemned woman, but their horror is palpable. You smell incense carried by attendants who treat this like any other funeral, even though the corpse still breathes. You witness something extraordinary when the procession reaches its destination. As the litter is opened and Cornelia emerges, dressed in burial clothes but standing upright, she makes a statement that electrifies everyone present. Her voice carries across the gathering as she declares, "Caesar thinks me unchaste. Me who performed the sacraments under which he won, he triumphed." You grasp the theological brilliance of her challenge. If Rome prospers under Domitian's rule, if the empire wins battles and expands territory, then the sacred flame has been tended properly, and the gods favor the Vestal's service. How can the emperor claim their chief priestess is impure when her religious duties have produced such obvious divine approval for his reign? You realize she's turned Roman religious logic against her persecutor. As Cornelia descends toward her tomb, you watch her stumble on the narrow steps. A soldier instinctively reaches out to steady her, but she pulls away from his touch. Even facing death, she maintains the absolute physical purity required of her office. You understand this gesture, witnessed by Pliny the Younger and recorded for history, proves her continued chastity. A truly corrupt Vestal would not be so careful about maintaining sacred boundaries in her final moments. A soldier reaches to help, you pull away. Even now, you keep the boundary. You observe the immediate aftermath of Cornelia's final statement rippling through Roman society. Within hours, her words spread beyond the execution site, carried by witnesses who whisper them to friends and family. You realize her challenge to Domitian's moral authority has created a theological crisis. Either she's innocent and the emperor has murdered Rome's holiest priestess, or she's guilty and Rome itself is cursed. You watch public opinion begin to shift in subtle but significant ways. Senators who remained silent during Domitian's previous purges start privately expressing doubts about the emperor's judgment. You notice that people discuss the execution with obvious unease, questioning whether divine justice would really demand the death of someone who had served faithfully for decades. The propaganda victory Domitian expected transforms into a public relations disaster. You learn that Cornelia's execution contributes to a broader pattern of imperial overreach, eventually destroys Domitian himself. His increasingly arbitrary violence and paranoid suspicions turn even his closest supporters against him. You realize that the same cruelty that murdered an innocent priestess will eventually consume the emperor who ordered her death. The theological implications of Cornelia's final statement continue reverberating, you observe. If Rome's military victories and political stability prove divine favor, then how could the chief priestess responsible for maintaining that favor be impure? You understand that Cornelia has created a logical trap that undermines the entire justification for her execution. If Rome prospered under your watch, who dares call you unchaste? You begin to recognize the broader patterns that make Cornelia's story possible. You realize that Roman society has created elaborate rituals and legal procedures that disguise barbarism as civilization. The careful ceremony surrounding vestal immurement, The burial clothes, the covered litter, the minimal provisions all serve to create psychological distance between executioners and victim. You understand how this systematized cruelty allows participants to avoid confronting their actions' moral reality. By wrapping murder in religious ceremony and legal procedure, Romans can tell themselves they're not really killing an innocent woman, but simply carrying out divine will. You recognize this pattern of bureaucratic brutality appearing throughout history whenever societies need to normalize atrocities. You observe how accusations of sexual impropriety serve as particularly effective weapons against women in positions of power. These charges are difficult to disprove, socially devastating, and allow accusers to claim moral high ground while destroying their targets. You realize this technique appears across cultures and centuries whenever patriarchal systems need to eliminate threatening women. The physical details of immurement reveal something crucial about how societies distance themselves from their own cruelty, you notice. The underground chamber isn't just a killing device, it's a psychological mechanism that allows executioners to avoid direct responsibility. The condemned woman doesn't die by human hands, but apparently chooses to perish rather than live with dishonor. When cruelty wears a uniform and a legal seal, do you notice it in time? You contemplate the broader implications of Cornelia's story for understanding power, justice, and human nature. You realize her execution wasn't an aberration in Roman history, but a logical extension of systems that treat human beings as political resources to be deployed or destroyed as needed. You understand that recognizing these patterns helps identify similar dynamics in contemporary contexts. You observe how Cornelia's final act of defiance demonstrates that even in the most hopeless circumstances, people can choose how to confront their fate. Her public challenge to Domitian's authority wasn't just an assertion of innocence, it was a form of moral resistance that outlasted her persecutor. You realize that courage in facing injustice can transform death into a statement that inspires others to question authority. You recognize that the institutions and protections people take for granted can disappear with frightening speed when those in power decide they're inconvenient. Cornelia's sacred status as Virgo Maxima couldn't protect her from imperial violence when her death served political purposes. You understand this serves as a warning about how quickly supposedly civilized societies can become barbaric when power faces no meaningful limits. The story of Rome's Vestal Virgins reflects broader tensions about female power that persist across cultures and centuries, you observe. Societies often accept women in positions of authority only when they conform to very specific expectations about behavior and sexuality. You realize that women who step outside these narrow boundaries, or who are perceived as threatening male power structures, face swift and often violent retaliation. If this could happen at the heart of Rome, what stops it anywhere? You stand again in the Roman Forum, but now you see it differently. The impressive marble columns and elaborate temples represent not just Roman achievement, but also Roman brutality. You realize that every great civilization builds its glory on foundations of systematic violence against the vulnerable. You understand that forgetting victims like Cornelia allows societies to maintain comfortable myths about their own righteousness. You recognize that Cornelia's courage in her final moments offers something more valuable than the empire that destroyed her. An example of individual conscience, bearing witness to truth, even when institutional protections fail. You realize that even when legal systems become weapons of oppression, people can still choose to resist with dignity. You understand that even when dying alone in darkness, they can still assert their humanity and challenge their persecutors. Her story deserves remembering not just as historical curiosity, but as inspiration for anyone who must choose between comfortable silence and dangerous truth, you realize. You understand that the flame Cornelia tended so faithfully represents something larger than Rome's temporal power. It symbolizes the human capacity to maintain hope and dignity in the face of overwhelming injustice. You grasp that contemporary societies face similar challenges to those that destroyed Cornelia. The temptation to sacrifice individual rights for collective security, the willingness to believe accusations against inconvenient people, the tendency to mistake legal procedure for moral justice. You realize that her story serves as both warning and guide for navigating these persistent dangers. What do you think about Cornelia's story? Does her courage in facing injustice inspire you, or does the system that destroyed her seem too familiar? Let me know in the comments below. And for more forgotten truths that powerful people would prefer you never learned, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These stories of survival and resistance need to be told, and your support helps ensure they won't be forgotten again.